John Kennedy opened a folder and showed AOC one document. She went silent for 47 seconds, then her career was over. What was in that folder destroyed everything she'd built. The mahogany table in Senate Hearing Room 2116 gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez adjusted her burgundy blazer and smiled confidently at the cameras. It was 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that would change everything. She'd walked into this routine campaign finance hearing thinking it was just another opportunity to showcase her progressive credentials, maybe go viral with a few sound bites about corporate greed and systemic inequality. She had no idea she was walking into the most meticulously planned political execution in Senate history. Senator John Kennedy sat across from her, his wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the camera lights, his pale blue eyes scanning a thick manila folder that rested closed on the table in front of him. The 73-year-old Louisiana senator looked almost grandfatherly in his charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, his expression carrying that trademark Southern gentleness that had lulled countless witnesses into a false sense of security before he destroyed them with facts. But what AOC didn't know was that Kennedy had spent the last 6 months building a case against her so comprehensive, so devastating, that even her own staff would abandon her before the day was over. The hearing room was packed beyond capacity. What appeared to be a routine oversight session had drawn an unusual crowd: investigative journalists with their phones ready, small business owners clutching printed emails, and a group of former AOC campaign workers whose faces were etched with something that looked remarkably like guilt. The energy in the room crackled with anticipation, as if everyone except AOC knew they were about to witness something historic. Chairman Roberts called the session to order, his voice carrying unusual gravity. Today we examine the critical matter of campaign finance transparency and the sacred trust between elected officials and their donors. The words seemed routine, but those who knew Kennedy's methods recognized them as a warning. This wasn't going to be a typical Washington dog and pony show. AOC leaned back in her chair, her confidence radiating across the room. She'd faced hostile hearings before and emerged stronger, turning attacks into fundraising opportunities and criticism into social media gold. Her 13.2 million Twitter followers were already live tweeting their support, her Instagram stories were queued up with behind-the-scenes content, and her communications team was ready to turn any Republican attack into proof of the establishment's fear of her progressive agenda. But Kennedy wasn't just any Republican, and this wasn't going to be an attack. It was going to be a surgical dismantling, 6 months in the making, built on AOC's own words, her own financial records, and her own campaign's internal communications that somehow, impossibly, had found their way into Kennedy's possession. The first sign that something was wrong came when Kennedy didn't immediately speak. Instead, he opened his folder with deliberate slowness, his fingers tracing the edge of the first document as if it were a precious artifact. The silence stretched for 10 seconds, then 15, then 20, until the room's ambient noise, the hum of cameras, the rustle of papers, the whispered conversations, all faded into an expectant hush. When Kennedy finally looked up, his smile was gentle, almost paternal, but his eyes held something that made AOC's press secretary shift uncomfortably in her seat. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, Kennedy began, his Louisiana drawl slower than usual, each word precisely enunciated. I want to thank you for being here today. I know your time is precious, and the American people appreciate your willingness to discuss how their hard-earned donations to your campaigns have been utilized. The pause before utilized was barely perceptible, but it sent a chill through the room. AOC's smile remained fixed, but something flickered behind her eyes, the first crack in her armor. Thank you, Senator Kennedy, she replied, her voice steady and professional. I'm always happy to discuss our grassroots movement and how we've built the largest small-dollar fundraising operation in congressional history. Kennedy nodded approvingly, his fingers still resting on the closed folder. That's exactly what I'd like to discuss, ma'am. Your grassroots operation is indeed remarkable. In fact, I've been studying it quite extensively. He paused, his smile widening just slightly, along with some of your supporters. But what Kennedy revealed next would make AOC realize she'd walked straight into a trap that had been 6 months in the making. Kennedy's fingers moved to the first document in his folder, but he didn't lift it out yet. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the tone of a professor about to deliver a particularly interesting lecture. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, in your last campaign cycle you raised approximately $17.3 million from what you've described as small-dollar donations from working families across America. That's quite an achievement, and I commend you for it. His tone was genuinely warm, almost congratulatory. However, I've become curious about where that money actually went. AOC's posture remained confident, but her press secretary was now frantically typing on her phone, sensing something in Kennedy's tone that her boss hadn't picked up on yet. "Senator, our campaign expenditures are all publicly reported to the FEC," AOC replied smoothly. "We've been transparent about every dollar we've spent fighting for working families." Kennedy's smile broadened. "Oh yes, ma'am. I've read every single FEC filing. Fascinating reading, actually. Particularly the payments to consulting firms." He lifted the first document from his folder, not revealing it yet, but holding it like a poker player with a royal flush. "Tell me, what exactly is Brand New Congress LLC?" The question seemed innocent enough, but AOC's chief of staff went rigid in his seat. Brand New Congress LLC was the consulting firm that had managed AOC's meteoric rise from bartender to congresswoman, taking a percentage of every donation, every merchandise sale, every speaking fee. It was also the firm that had been operating in a legal gray area that Kennedy had spent months investigating. Brand New Congress is the organization that recruited me to run for office and helped build our grassroots infrastructure, AOC answered carefully. Kennedy nodded thoughtfully. "And how much has your campaign paid to Brand New Congress LLC since 2018? I'd have to review the exact figures, but it's all been properly reported." $4.6 million, Kennedy said quietly, his drawl making the number seem to hang in the air like smoke. "Your campaigns have paid $4.6 million to Brand New Congress LLC over the past 5 years. The room went dead silent. Even AOC's most ardent supporters in the gallery seemed stunned by the figure. Kennedy wasn't finished. "Now ma'am, that's interesting for a couple of reasons. First, Brand New Congress LLC is owned by your former chief of staff, Saikat Chakrabarty. Second, it's registered as an LLC, not a traditional political consulting firm, which means it doesn't have to disclose how it spends the money it receives from your campaign." AOC's voice remained steady, but there was a slight tightness around her eyes. "Senator, all of our payments have been reviewed by election lawyers and found to be in compliance with FEC regulations." Kennedy's expression didn't change, but he lifted a second document from his folder. "That's what's so fascinating about this situation, Representative. You see, I've been in touch with several former employees of Brand New Congress LLC. Interesting conversations." The words hit the room like a physical force. AOC's communications director actually dropped her phone, the clatter echoing in the sudden silence. Because if Kennedy had been talking to former Brand New Congress employees, he might know about the internal communications, the strategy sessions, the discussions about how to structure payments to avoid scrutiny. "These former employees," Kennedy continued, his voice still gentle but relentless, "have provided some rather illuminating information about how your campaign funds were actually spent. Would you like to hear about it?" But what Kennedy said next would leave AOC speechless for exactly 47 seconds. A silence that would be replayed millions of times across social media and mark the beginning of the end of her political career. Kennedy lifted a third document from his folder, and this time he held it up so AOC could see it, though the cameras in gallery couldn't make out the details. AOC's eyes focused on the paper, and for the first time since the hearing began, her confident expression cracked. The document was an internal email from Brand New Congress LLC, dated 3 months earlier, with AOC's personal email address in the recipient line. The subject line, visible even from across the table, read, "Rise Luxury Lifestyle Fund Allocation. Representative Ocasio-Cortez," Kennedy said, his voice still maddeningly polite. "Can you explain to the committee what a luxury lifestyle fund is and why your campaign donors might be interested to know they've been contributing to it?" AOC's mouth opened, but no words came out. The seconds ticked by, 10, 20, 30. Her press secretary was making frantic cutting motions with her hand, trying to signal for a recess, but AOC seemed frozen, staring at the document in Kennedy's hand. 40 seconds. 45. The silence was becoming deafening, cameras zooming in on AOC's face as the color drained from her cheeks. 47 seconds of complete silence before AOC finally found her voice, and when she spoke it was barely above a whisper. Kennedy's smile never wavered. "Of course, ma'am. Take all the time you need." He set the document back in his folder but left it open, the damning email still partially visible. We have plenty more to discuss. The hearing room erupted. Reporters were frantically typing, photographers were capturing AOC's stunned expression, and her staff was in full crisis mode. But Kennedy simply sat back in his chair, his folder still open, dozens more documents visible, each one apparently more devastating than the last. In those 47 seconds of silence, everyone in the room, including AOC, realized that her career as the untouchable progressive icon was over. Kennedy hadn't just prepared for this hearing. He had orchestrated the complete destruction of her political reputation with the methodical precision of a master strategist. The luxury lifestyle fund was just the beginning. Kennedy's folder contained bank records showing campaign money being used for designer clothing, expensive dinners at five-star restaurants, first-class flights for personal travel, and luxury accommodations that had nothing to do with campaign activities. More damaging still were the internal communications showing AOC's team deliberately structuring these payments to avoid FEC scrutiny. As the hearing recessed and AOC's team huddled in emergency session, Kennedy remained at the table, occasionally flipping through his folder. When a reporter managed to get close enough to ask him a question, Kennedy's response was characteristically understated. "Well, I reckon the American people deserve to know how their donations are being spent. Seems like a reasonable expectation to me." What happened in the next 72 hours would complete AOC's political destruction. The fallout was swift and merciless. Within 6 hours of the hearing, Luxury Lifestyle Fund was trending #1 on Twitter, with millions of posts from outraged small-dollar donors who felt betrayed. The hashtag was accompanied by screenshots of AOC's own tweets about fighting for working families while apparently using their donations to fund a lifestyle they could never afford. The internal brand new Congress emails that Kennedy's team had somehow obtained painted a picture of systematic deception. Messages showed AOC's team discussing how to categorize luxury purchases as campaign expenses, how to use shell companies to hide the true nature of expenditures, and most damaging of all, mocking the suckers who donated $5 and $10 thinking they were funding a grassroots revolution. One email, sent from AOC's personal account to her campaign manager, would become the smoking gun that ended her career. "These people will donate to anything if we package it right. Make sure the lifestyle fund gets disguised as outreach activities on the FEC reports. They're too stupid to read the fine print anyway." When Kennedy released that email during a follow-up press conference, AOC's political death was complete. The progressive movement that had rallied around her began to fracture. Fellow squad members distanced themselves from her. Major progressive organizations that had endorsed her pulled their support. Most devastatingly, the small-dollar donors who had powered her rise abandoned her en masse. Her approval rating in her own district plummeted from 78% to 31% in less than a week. Primary challengers immediately announced their candidacies, armed with Kennedy's evidence and the narrative that AOC had betrayed the working families she claimed to represent. AOC's attempts to defend herself only made things worse. Her claim that the emails were taken out of context was undermined when Kennedy released the full email threads, showing even more damaging content. Her assertion that the luxury expenditures were necessary for effective representation was mocked across social media by constituents who couldn't afford basic health care. The final blow came when the FEC announced a formal investigation into her campaign finances, followed quickly by a DOJ probe into possible wire fraud and campaign finance violations. The woman who had once seemed destined for higher office was now facing the possibility of federal prison. Kennedy, characteristically, remained modest about his role in AOC's downfall. When asked by reporters how he had obtained such damaging internal communications, he smiled his gentle smile and said, "Sometimes people just want to do the right thing. I'm proud of those who had the courage to come forward." The truth, which would emerge months later, was even more devastating to AOC's legacy. The former brand new Congress employees who had provided Kennedy with the evidence had tried to raise concerns internally about the misuse of campaign funds. When they were ignored or threatened with legal action, they had gone to Kennedy as a last resort. AOC had destroyed herself not just through her corruption, but through her treatment of the idealistic young staffers who had believed in her message and been horrified to discover it was all a lie. 6 months after Kennedy opened that folder and showed AOC the document that ended her career, she announced she would not seek re-election. Her political obituary would be written not by her opponents, but by the small-dollar donors who had once seen her as their champion and now saw her as just another corrupt politician who had betrayed their trust. Kennedy's folder, it turned out, contained more than just documents. It contained the complete destruction of a political career built on a foundation of lies. And in those 47 seconds of silence, as AOC stared at the evidence of her own corruption, everyone in that hearing room knew they were witnessing the end of a political phenomenon. The folder's contents would be studied for years as a masterclass in how to expose corruption through methodical investigation and strategic revelation. Kennedy had proven that in politics, as in life, the truth has a way of emerging, especially when it's in the hands of someone who knows how to use it. As for AOC, her name would become synonymous with the danger of believing your own hype and the price of betraying the people who trusted you most. The woman who had once tweeted about fighting for the forgotten had herself been forgotten, destroyed by the very evidence of how she had forgotten them. The folder John Kennedy opened that day didn't just contain documents, it contained justice,